"Stop the trial! I have something to say!" The sharp, youthful voice cut through the courtroom like a knife. For a moment, everything froze. Judge Margaret Sloane, a stern woman in her 60s with silver-rimmed glasses, paused mid-sentence, her gavel raised in the air. The defense attorney, Rachel Carter, turned sharply toward the voice, her stack of papers forgotten in her hands. Even the prosecutor, David Owens, who had been delivering his argument with conviction, stopped mid-word, his mouth hanging open as if someone had pressed pause on him. All eyes turned to the boy standing in the aisle. Owen Carter was small for his age, with tousled blonde hair and wide blue eyes that burned with determination. He couldn't have been older than 11, yet he stood there, fists clenched, sneakers squeaking slightly against the polished courtroom floor as he shifted his weight. "Bailiff!" Judge Sloane's voice was sharp. "Get that child out of here!" Before the bailiff could move, Owen shouted, his voice cracking but unwavering. "You can't throw me out! I know something! Something that will change everything!" The courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators murmured, some gasping, others craning their necks to get a better look at the boy. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. The jurors exchanged confused glances, unsure whether this was a planned testimony or just a disruption. Judge Sloane slammed her gavel 3 times, demanding order, though her gaze remained fixed on the boy. There was something in her eyes, suspicion, but also curiosity. "What could you possibly know, son?" she asked, her voice calmer but no less authoritative. "This is a murder trial. You shouldn't even be here." Owen swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling as he took a deep breath. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to stand tall. "Because I know who really did it," he said, his voice trembling yet firm. "And it wasn't him." He pointed directly at the defendant, Daniel Reeves, the man accused of murdering his girlfriend, Emily Foster. A collective hush fell over the room. At the defense table, Daniel sat motionless. His hollow cheeks and exhausted eyes showed the toll the trial had taken on him. He looked at Owen as if seeing a ghost. Judge Sloane leaned forward, her brows knitting together. "Who are you?" she demanded. "And what do you mean by that?" Before Owen could answer, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. A man in a dark suit rushed in, his face pale and frantic. "Owen!" he shouted. "What are you doing here?" Owen flinched at the sound of his name, but didn't turn around. He couldn't. Not now. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have to listen to me." Judge Sloane hesitated for a moment, then turned to the bailiff. "Take him to my chambers," she ordered. "We'll continue this privately. Everyone else, stay seated. This trial isn't over." The bailiff gently took Owen by the arm and led him toward a side door. As he walked away, Owen stole one last glance over his shoulder, locking eyes with Daniel Reeves. The man's face was a mixture of shock, hope, and something else. Desperation. Then the door closed behind Owen with a heavy thud, leaving the courtroom buzzing with unanswered questions. The story began long before Owen ever stepped into that courtroom. Before all of this, he had been just an ordinary kid from a quiet Ohio town. The kind of boy who spent summer afternoons playing baseball with his friends, devoured too much pizza on Friday nights, and dreaded his math homework. But Owen also had something that set him apart, an eye for detail. His mother often told him he had an old soul, though Owen wasn't entirely sure what that meant. He just noticed things most people overlooked. And one summer afternoon, he noticed something he couldn't ignore. It had been a warm July day, and Owen had been riding his bike through Maplewood Park, his usual shortcut home. The lake shimmered under the setting sun, and families were packing up their picnic blankets, That's when he saw them. A man and a woman, standing near the edge of the lake. They weren't just talking. They were arguing. The man, tall, with dark hair and an angular face, kept pointing at the woman, his gestures sharp, almost frantic. The woman, shorter, blonde, kept shaking her head, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. Something about their body language made Owen uneasy. He slowed his bike and pulled off to the side, watching from behind a tree. Then, the argument escalated. The man grabbed the woman's arm. She yanked away. He grabbed her again, harder this time. Owen's stomach twisted. He wanted to do something, to yell, to intervene. But he was just a kid. What could he do? A moment later, the man looked around, scanning the area. Then he shoved her toward a car, a dark blue sedan with a dent in the rear bumper. Owen's hands clenched around his handlebars. The woman resisted. She was yelling, but no sound reached Owen's ears. The wind carried her words away before they could reach him. Then, with one last forceful push, the man shoved her into the car, slammed the door, and drove off. Owen sat there, frozen. A deep pit formed in his stomach. His heart pounded against his ribs. He went home and told his mom. "Sweetheart, it was probably just a couple having a fight," she had said, ruffling his hair. "I'm sure they worked it out." But Owen couldn't forget. The image replayed in his mind over and over. The fear in the woman's eyes, the way the man had looked around before forcing her into the car. A week later, when he saw that same man's face on the news, his heart stopped. His name was Daniel Reeves, and he was being accused of murdering Emily Foster. Owen wanted to believe that the man he saw was innocent. But everyone, the media, the police, even his own neighbors, seemed convinced that Daniel was guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. Emily's fingerprints were found in Daniel's car. Witnesses claimed to have heard them arguing the night she disappeared. Daniel had no alibi. But one thing didn't make sense. The woman Owen saw that day was blonde. Emily Foster had dark brown hair, which meant one of two things. Owen was mistaken, and he hadn't seen Daniel at all. The police were wrong, and there was another woman involved. And if that was true, then Daniel Reeves might be innocent, and someone else had killed Emily. Owen sat in Judge Sloane's chambers, his hands fidgeting in his lap. The room felt enormous, with towering bookcases filled with thick, leather-bound volumes and a heavy oak desk that seemed to swallow up the space. Judge Sloane, now seated behind that very desk, regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "All right, young man," she said, folding her hands in front of her. "You've caused quite the disruption in my courtroom. Now tell me, who are you? And what is this secret you claim to know?" Owen swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His mother always told him he had a habit of jumping into things without thinking, and maybe she was right. But this wasn't something he could just keep to himself. "My name is Owen Carter," he said, his voice quieter now, but still steady. "And I think you've got the wrong guy on trial." Judge Sloane arched an eyebrow. "That's a serious accusation. Explain yourself." Owen took a deep breath. "I saw Daniel Reeves that day, in the park. But he wasn't with Emily Foster. He was arguing with someone else, a blonde woman." He hesitated, then added, "Emily had dark brown hair." Judge Sloane leaned back, tapping her fingers against the desk. "You're telling me that Daniel Reeves was with another woman on the day Emily Foster disappeared?" Owen nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I didn't know who he was at the time, but when I saw his face on the news, I recognized him." The judge's expression was unreadable. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Did you tell anyone about this before now?" I told my mom, Owen admitted, but she didn't think it was important. Judge Sloane sighed and leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk. Owen, you've put me in a very difficult position. On one hand, you're just a child, and this is a murder trial with serious consequences. On the other hand, if what you're saying is true, it could change everything. I need to know one thing. Are you absolutely certain about what you saw? Owen met her gaze, his blue eyes unwavering. I'm sure. Judge Sloane nodded slowly. All right, she said. I'll have to bring this to the attorneys and see if there's any merit to your story. But you need to understand something, Owen. This is far from over. Your testimony alone isn't enough to overturn the evidence we've seen so far. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, Owen said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. Back in the courtroom, Daniel Reeves sat at the defense table, staring at his hands. He had no idea what the boy had said to the judge, but the interruption had left him shaken. For months, he had been drowning in hopelessness, watching as the world turned against him. The evidence was stacked too high, the witnesses too convincing. Even his own lawyer, Rachel Carter, seemed to be losing faith. He glanced at the courtroom doors, wondering about the boy who had burst in like a whirlwind. Why would a kid risk so much to speak up for me? Daniel didn't have children. He barely had friends anymore. Who would care enough to take such a chance? Before he could dwell on it further, the judge returned to the bench. The murmurs in the room quieted as she sat down and adjusted her glasses. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her tone measured. We've had an unexpected development. I'll be meeting with counsel from both sides in chambers to discuss a potential new witness. The prosecutor, David Owens, frowned. Your Honor, this sounds highly irregular. Who is this witness? A boy named Owen Carter, Judge Sloane replied. He claims to have information relevant to this case. Rachel Carter perked up, curiosity flashing across her face. What sort of information? That will be determined after we meet, Judge Sloane said firmly. For now, we will adjourn until tomorrow morning. She brought her gavel down with a decisive crack, and the courtroom erupted into noise. Reporters scrambled to get statements, spectators whispered furiously, and Daniel sat frozen in his seat. Is this my chance at freedom? Or just another cruel twist in an already unbearable nightmare? That evening, Owen sat at the dinner table, absently poking at his spaghetti with his fork. His mom, Jessica Carter, watched him carefully. You've been quiet, she said. Did something happen at the courthouse today? Owen hesitated. He wasn't sure how much to tell her. I saw something during the trial, he said vaguely. Something that made me think. Jessica frowned. You didn't cause any trouble, did you? Owen shook his head quickly. No, ma'am, he lied. I just listened. Jessica sighed, seeming to accept his answer. All right, she said. But you stay out of it, Owen. This is grown-up business. It's not for kids. Owen nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. I had to speak up. I couldn't just let them send an innocent man to prison. The next morning, the courtroom was packed again. Owen sat outside the judge's chambers with his mother, who had finally caught wind of his involvement. She was furious, trying her best to stay calm. You're lucky they didn't throw you in jail, she whispered harshly. Do you know how much trouble you could be in? I had to, Mom, Owen said quietly. I couldn't just let them send an innocent man to prison. Jessica rubbed her temples, exasperated. You don't know that for sure, she said. You're just a kid. Before Owen could respond, the bailiff appeared and gestured for them to enter. Inside, the attorneys were already seated, their expressions a mix of skepticism and intrigue. The judge motioned for Owen to take a seat next to her desk. "Owen," Judge Sloan began, "I want you to tell these people what you told me yesterday. Leave nothing out." Owen nodded and took a deep breath. He described the scene in the park again, this time with more detail. The way the man had looked around nervously, the car's make and model, the woman's appearance. The defense attorney, Rachel Carter, scribbled notes furiously while the prosecutor leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. When Owen finished, the room was silent. Rachel Carter was the first to speak. "Your Honor, this testimony could be crucial. If there's any chance another woman was involved, we need to investigate." The prosecutor scoffed. "It's a child's story," he said dismissively. "We have hard evidence linking Daniel Reeves to the crime. This doesn't change that." "It changes everything," Rachel shot back. "If there's an alternate suspect, it raises reasonable doubt." The judge held up her hand, silencing them both. "Enough," she said. "I'll allow the defense to follow up on this lead. But make no mistake, this boy's testimony is not enough to overturn the case on its own. You'll need corroborating evidence." Owen's heart sank. He had hoped his story would be enough, but it seemed the fight was just beginning. As he left the chambers with his mom, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made himself a target. Whoever the real killer was, they wouldn't want him to keep digging. The following days dragged on like molasses. Owen couldn't shake the tension that had settled over him ever since he'd stepped into Judge Sloan's chambers. He had been part of something that could change everything, but now it felt like all he'd done was poke a hornet's nest. No one believed him. Not really. The detectives had visited his school, spoken to his mom, and even interviewed a few of his classmates, all trying to figure out if Owen was just a kid spinning a story. They hadn't found anything concrete. In their eyes, the case was open and shut. Daniel Reeves had been the last person seen with Emily Foster, and forensic evidence tied him to her disappearance. But Owen had seen something else. He wasn't crazy. He was sure of it. Still, every time he replayed the scene in his mind, the man, the woman, it felt incomplete. Who was the woman? Why had they argued so fiercely? And why had Emily's name never come up? Owen spent hours trying to piece it together, sitting in his room with the blinds pulled shut, scribbling down notes in his notepad. He couldn't let go of the feeling that there was something more, something buried deep within the case, just beyond his grasp. Meanwhile, the investigation was spiraling into new territory. Rachel Carter, the defense attorney, had insisted that the police investigate the woman Owen described, though the idea had been met with skepticism. Detective Williams, who had been working the case since day one, was reluctantly following up on the lead. "I'll be honest," he said to his partner, Sarah Cooper, one afternoon as they sifted through their files. "This kid might have been seeing things. The guy's guilty as hell. I don't see how his story changes anything." "I don't know," Sarah replied, her fingers tapping on the file in front of her. "There's something about it. The timing lines up. If Reeves wasn't with Emily, then where was she? And who was the other woman?" "You're telling me to chase a ghost," Williams muttered, but he had already stood up and started gathering the case files. "Fine, we'll follow up. But don't get your hopes up." The next day, Owen was called to the courthouse again. This time, he wasn't just a bystander. He had been asked to testify in front of the jury. His stomach twisted in knots as his mother led him into the courtroom. She was unnervingly quiet, her eyes constantly flicking to the front where Daniel Reeves sat, his face a mask of uncertainty. Owen could barely make eye contact with him. Would the man look different once he knew who had really been there that day? He felt out of place in the stiff courtroom. Too young, too small for the weight of the proceedings. But as the bailiff called his name, Owen stood and made his way to the witness stand. The air was thick with tension, and every pair of eyes in the room was on him. Judge Sloane's voice broke the silence. "Owen Carter, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," Owen said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Go ahead and tell us what you saw that day," the judge prompted. Owen hesitated for a moment, swallowing hard. His mom had warned him to stick to the facts. Just tell the truth. Keep it simple. But there was so much more he needed to say. "I saw Daniel Reeves in the park," Owen began, "but he wasn't with Emily Foster. He was with a woman. She was blonde, and they were arguing. They were really mad, yelling at each other. I saw them a little before everything happened." He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, but he kept his gaze straight ahead. "I didn't know who they were then, but when I saw the news, I remembered Daniel's face. It was him." The prosecutor, David Owens, stood up and began questioning Owen. "So, what you're telling us, young man, is that you saw Daniel Reeves with a different woman in the park, not Emily Foster?" Owen nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle like bricks in his chest. "Yes." David Owens exchanged a glance with his colleague, then turned back to Owen. "And you're sure of this?" "I'm sure," Owen said, a little louder this time, his voice steady despite the knots in his stomach. The prosecutor sat down, his brow furrowed, clearly not satisfied. Rachel Carter, however, seemed intrigued. She stood and walked toward Owen, her steps measured. "Can you tell us more about the argument? Did you hear anything about what they were saying?" she asked, her tone soft but probing. Owen paused, his mind racing. "I couldn't hear exactly. They were far enough away. But the man seemed really mad. Like he was blaming her for something. I don't know. It wasn't about Emily. It was something else." Rachel nodded thoughtfully and glanced toward the judge. "Your Honor, I think it's crucial that we follow up on this lead. This could be the breakthrough we need." Judge Sloane turned to the prosecution. "You have objections?" she asked. David Owens didn't hesitate. "This is just a child's story. It doesn't prove anything. We have physical evidence linking Mr. Reeves to Emily Foster. This is a distraction." Rachel Carter shot back quickly. "If the evidence leads to a different woman, we have to investigate it. We can't just ignore this." Judge Sloane sighed, clearly weighing the situation. "I'll allow for further investigation, but I want this to be handled carefully. We're not going to derail this trial over unfounded speculation." The day ended with no clear resolution, but Owen couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break wide open. He didn't know who the woman was, but he felt sure she wasn't just a random bystander. Why else would Daniel Reeves have been so angry with her? As he and his mom left the courthouse that afternoon, Owen noticed something strange. A black SUV was parked across the street, the windows tinted too dark to make out the driver. It wasn't just any car. It was the same make and model as the one he had seen that day in the park. Could it be connected? Could the person in the car have been watching him? He shivered as they walked past the vehicle, but he didn't say anything to his mom. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe it wasn't. Back at the station, Detective Williams and Sarah Cooper were poring over the details of the case again, this time focusing on the new lead Owen had provided. The woman, the argument, everything pointed to something deeper, something they hadn't even begun to consider. Sarah leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. "This doesn't feel right. The argument, the timing, and that SUV? We need to dig into this. I don't think it's just a coincidence anymore." Williams sighed but nodded. "Yeah, I'm starting to think you're right. Let's see where this rabbit hole leads. The days following Owen's testimony were a whirlwind. The courtroom buzzed with speculation, and the media outlets latched onto the new angle in the case: the mysterious woman. Detective Williams and Sarah Cooper had reluctantly agreed to dig deeper into the lead. They couldn't ignore the fact that Owen's description of the argument had raised some troubling questions. But the more they dug into the story, the more confusing it became. It was early evening when Sarah first heard the name. She had been reviewing old case files on the Reeves investigation, trying to cross-reference anything that might hint at this elusive woman Owen had described. At first, there had been nothing. No known associates, no acquaintances who fit the bill. But then something caught her eye. Something she hadn't considered before. There had been a woman who visited Daniel Reeves in prison just before his trial began. The reports were brief, buried deep in the notes. Nothing more than a name: Lily Bradford. She was listed as a former associate of Daniel's, but her connection to Emily Foster was never made clear. Williams hadn't been convinced about Owen's lead. He'd dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination. But when Sarah brought up Lily Bradford, he hesitated. "Do you think she could be connected?" he asked, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," Sarah replied. Her eyes narrowed as she thought back to everything they'd seen. "But it's worth checking out. If Owen's right about the woman in the park, and if this is the same woman who has ties to Daniel, then we've got a whole new angle on the case." Williams sighed. "I'll make some calls. Let's see what we can find." The following morning, Sarah and Williams drove out to a small, quiet town on the outskirts of the city. They had tracked down Lily Bradford's last known address, a modest house tucked away on a tree-lined street. It looked like any other suburban home, small, neat, and almost entirely unremarkable. But the moment Sarah stepped out of the car, she couldn't shake the sense that they were about to uncover something they weren't prepared for. They knocked on the door, and it creaked open slowly. A woman in her late 30s stood on the other side, her eyes narrowing as if sizing them up. She was tall and thin, with shoulder-length blonde hair. She didn't speak for a moment, but her posture was stiff, guarded. "We're looking for Lily Bradford," Sarah said, flashing her badge. "We need to ask you a few questions about Daniel Reeves." The woman's eyes flickered with a mix of surprise and something darker. Fear, perhaps? She didn't invite them inside, but didn't shut the door either. After a long pause, she spoke. "Why are you asking about Daniel?" Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that made Sarah cautious. "We're investigating his involvement in the disappearance of Emily Foster. We believe you may know something that could help us," Williams said, his tone direct but not aggressive. Lily hesitated. She glanced over her shoulder, as if weighing whether to answer. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low. "I don't know anything about Emily Foster, okay? Daniel's been in jail for months. You should talk to him." But Sarah wasn't convinced. "We know that you visited him recently. You were in contact with him before his trial. What was that about?" Lily's face went pale. She took a deep breath, then stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. "Come in," she said quietly. "I'll tell you what I know." Inside, the house was sparsely decorated. The air was thick with an odd tension that Sarah couldn't place. Lily led them to a small living room where they sat down on mismatched chairs. For a moment, neither of the detectives spoke as Lily took a long, slow breath, collecting her thoughts. "I don't know what you've heard," she began, "but I'm not the person you're looking for. Daniel isn't the person you think he is, either." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Lily's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "I used to work with Daniel. We were part of a group. People who, well, We did things we're not proud of. But Emily Foster was never involved. She wasn't the target. It was something else entirely. Sarah and Williams exchanged glances. "What was it about?" Williams asked, leaning forward. Lily swallowed hard. "Daniel got involved with some pretty dangerous people. People you wouldn't want to cross. He owes them a lot of money. And Emily." She paused, then shook her head. She wasn't supposed to be part of this. But she found out. She knew too much. And she started asking questions. It was like a switch had been flipped. Everything that Owen had described, the argument, the tension in the air, it suddenly made sense. Lily's words connected the dots in a way they hadn't before. Emily had discovered something she wasn't meant to know, and she had become a threat to those who had secrets to protect. "Did Daniel try to stop her?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with urgency. Lily nodded slowly. "He didn't want her to get involved. He was trying to protect her in his own way, but it didn't work. He couldn't get out of it. Not until it was too late." "And the woman in the park?" Williams asked, his voice low. "Who was she?" Lily's face hardened. "She's not someone you want to deal with. Her name's Marie. She's the one who made sure Emily didn't talk to anyone else about what she knew. She's connected to the same people Daniel owes money to." Sarah felt a cold chill creeping over her as everything began to fall into place. So, Emily found out something about Daniel's debt. She was about to expose it? Lily nodded again, her eyes downcast. Yes, that's why she was killed. Not because of her relationship with Daniel, but because she was a liability. She had to be silenced. The room felt suffocating as Sarah processed the implications. And Daniel? What does he have to say about all of this? Lily's eyes darkened. He doesn't know everything. He was trying to protect her, even if he didn't understand the full extent of it. He's guilty of a lot, but not of what you think. As they left Lily's house, Williams and Sarah were silent, each processing the gravity of what they had just learned. The case was no longer just about Daniel Reeves. It was bigger, far more complicated than they had realized. For Sarah, the puzzle was finally starting to come together. But there was still one piece missing. The woman, Marie. If she was the key to everything, finding her would be the only way to uncover the truth behind Emily Foster's disappearance. The more Sarah and Williams delved into the tangled web surrounding Emily Foster's disappearance, the clearer it became that they were not merely dealing with a missing persons case, but a much darker, more dangerous world. Each new lead seemed to pull them deeper into the shadows, revealing secrets that no one seemed willing to confront. After their conversation with Lily Bradford, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something crucial. Despite the revelations about Daniel Reeves's involvement with shady figures and his hidden debt, there was one key piece of the puzzle still out of reach. The woman named Marie. Everything pointed to her being the missing link, the one who had orchestrated Emily's disappearance, but they had no solid leads to go on. They needed to track her down. "We've got to get to her before she vanishes again," Sarah said, as she stared at her laptop, scanning through the new information they had gathered on Marie. Williams leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Yeah, but we don't even know where to start. Lily didn't have much to say about her, just that she's connected to some dangerous people. For all we know, Marie's got her own little network, one we've never even heard of." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "That's exactly it. If she's been in the background, pulling strings, then we have to assume she's been careful, invisible. But there's always a trail. People like her, criminals who hide in the shadows, they slip up eventually. All we have to do is find that one slip." The next day, They met with the team at the precinct to reassess their strategy. Sarah and Williams, along with a few other officers, pored over the known details, trying to see connections they might have missed earlier. In the case files, there were mentions of people who had come into contact with Daniel Reeves before his arrest. Debt collectors, criminals, and even a few names that appeared in police reports about organized crime syndicates operating in the city. The more they searched, the more it became clear. Marie wasn't just a lone operator. She had connections, a network of people who worked under her, who shielded her from the public eye. Whoever she was, she had made a conscious effort to stay hidden. But there was one detail that caught Sarah's eye. One name kept cropping up in reports about a certain underground group operating in the city, Caden Rossi. He was known as a middleman for organized crime and had a reputation for working with people like Marie. Sarah couldn't wait any longer. She called Williams as soon as she saw the connection. "We need to go after Rossi. He's the key to finding Marie." The two detectives arrived at Rossi's last known location, an upscale high-rise apartment in a luxury building near the waterfront. The building had security cameras, an array of doormen, and a clean, modern facade. But Sarah knew better than to be fooled by appearances. Rossi was the kind of person who knew how to stay under the radar, no matter how fancy his lifestyle might seem. They approached the building cautiously, taking care not to draw attention. Williams pulled out his phone to check for any updates from their surveillance team, while Sarah scanned the area for any signs of movement. Everything seemed unnervingly quiet. When they reached the door to Rossi's apartment, they didn't knock. Instead, Williams signaled for Sarah to wait, as he rang the bell and quickly stepped back. A moment later, the door swung open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stood on the other side. His expression was neutral, but there was a sharpness in his eyes, like he was sizing them up in an instant. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm but guarded. "We're looking for Caden Rossi," Williams said, his voice steady. "We have some questions about a woman named Marie." At the mention of Marie's name, Rossi's eyes flickered for a split second, just long enough for Sarah to notice, but not long enough to give away any clear reaction. "I don't know any Marie," Rossi replied, his tone firm. "I think you've got the wrong apartment." Williams didn't buy it. "We know you're connected to people who know her. We need to talk to you, and you're going to help us." Rossi took a step back, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "I'm afraid I'm not in the mood for a chat. Now, if you'll excuse me." Before he could shut the door, Williams pushed forward, forcing it open slightly. "We're not leaving until we get some answers." Rossi's demeanor shifted in an instant, his eyes narrowing. "You've made a mistake." What happened next unfolded so quickly that Sarah barely had time to react. Rossi's hand shot to the doorframe, pulling out a gun from a hidden holster under his jacket. The barrel gleamed in the hallway light. "Step back," Rossi hissed, the gun trained on them. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're in over your heads." Sarah's heart raced. She didn't flinch. Instead, she took a careful step forward, using her training to remain calm. "We don't want trouble, Rossi," she said, her voice steady. "We're just trying to find Marie. You're the only person who can help us." For a moment, the tension hung in the air like a thick fog. Rossi's hand wavered, and Sarah knew he was weighing his options. He wasn't entirely comfortable holding a weapon, not with two detectives in front of him. Finally, Rossi exhaled sharply and lowered the gun slightly. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he muttered, his voice quiet but laced with venom. "Marie isn't someone you want to go after. She's too dangerous. You won't find her, and if you keep digging, you won't live long enough to regret it." Sarah's grip tightened on her own weapon, though she kept it holstered for now. "Tell us what you know, Rossi," This is your last chance. Rossi looked at them one last time, his eyes full of something like disdain, or maybe fear. He turned, walked away, and slammed the door in their faces. The encounter left them shaken, but Sarah wasn't ready to give up. They had been close, closer than ever to finding Marie, and they weren't about to let fear stop them. As they turned to leave the building, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. They couldn't afford to fail now. The answers they needed were out there, somewhere. And no matter how deep the darkness ran, Sarah was determined to find the light. The tension in the air was palpable as Sarah and Williams left Caden Rossi's apartment, their minds racing with new questions and a growing sense of urgency. It had been clear that Rossi knew more than he was willing to say, but that didn't stop them from pressing forward. There was no turning back now. They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the city filling the space between them. The streets outside were busy as always, but inside the car, it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the road ahead, her thoughts spinning as she processed the encounter with Rossi. "He knows something," Williams finally said, breaking the silence. "But he's scared. He didn't give us much, but that look in his eyes, I've seen it before. He's not just trying to protect himself, he's terrified of Marie." "Which means we're getting closer," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "If he's that scared, then she's even more dangerous than we thought. But why is he so scared of her? What does she have on him?" Williams glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "Maybe it's not just Marie herself. Maybe it's the people she works with. Whoever they are, they're not just criminals. There's something bigger, something more powerful." Sarah nodded. "That's exactly it. And we're running out of time. Emily's life is on the line, and if Marie's connected to these powerful people, then they're not going to hesitate to take her out if they think we're getting too close." The words hit Sarah like a cold wave. Time. It was the one thing they didn't have enough of. Every moment spent chasing shadows was one more moment that Emily might be slipping further from their reach. They stopped by the precinct to regroup. Sarah pulled out the file on Marie, studying every detail once more. There was something about the way Marie had stayed hidden for so long that nagged at her. She wasn't just someone who had gone off the grid. She had intentionally built a network of people, a network that kept her safe and out of reach. There had to be a reason. As the evening wore on, Sarah and Williams decided to take another approach. Instead of focusing solely on Marie, they decided to investigate the larger network, starting with the mysterious figures she worked with. They called in favors from their contacts in organized crime units, asking for any leads on syndicates that might be connected to Marie's operations. Hours passed, but eventually the pieces began to fall into place. "Sarah," Williams said, his voice a mix of surprise and excitement, "I think we've got something." Sarah snapped her attention to him. "What is it?" Williams opened up a new set of documents on his laptop, pointing to a set of names that had appeared in various investigations over the years, names tied to powerful crime families, drug rings, and human trafficking operations. "These names," Williams continued, "they've all been linked to a man named Victor Klein. He's an enforcer for one of the most notorious syndicates in the country. And look at this. He's been in contact with Marie multiple times in the past year." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Victor Klein. That name's been coming up more and more. "I thought it was just another lead, but now it looks like it's the key to everything." "Exactly," Williams said, "and the more I dig into Klein's operations, the clearer it gets. He's known for working with people like Marie, hidden figures who operate on the fringes of society. They're the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes, the ones who can make people disappear without a trace. With this new information, Sarah felt a renewed sense of urgency. Victor Klein was their next target, but finding him wasn't going to be easy. He didn't operate like other criminals. They couldn't just show up at his front door and hope to find answers. Klein was far too careful for that. They began to dig deeper into his operations, identifying his known associates and mapping out the locations where he had been spotted in the past few months. Every lead brought them closer to him, but the closer they got, the more dangerous things became. There were whispers of Klein's ruthlessness, of people who had crossed him disappearing without a trace. He was a man who played by his own rules, and those who didn't toe the line paid the price. They got a break when they received a tip from one of their informants in the underground world. A nightclub downtown, the Black Dove, was rumored to be one of Klein's known haunts. The club had a reputation for being a place where criminals and the elite met in the dark, far away from the prying eyes of the law. It was the perfect place for someone like Klein to operate unnoticed. Sarah and Williams didn't waste any time. They grabbed their gear and headed straight for the nightclub, hoping they could find something, anything, that would lead them to Klein and, ultimately, to Marie. The nightclub was alive with music and people, the heavy bass vibrating through the walls as they made their way inside. The air was thick with smoke, and the neon lights cast an eerie glow over the room. Sarah felt the weight of the darkness pressing in on her as they made their way toward the back, where the VIP area was located. They had to be careful. One wrong move, and they could blow their cover. They approached the bouncer at the door, flashing their badges. The man didn't look impressed, but he knew better than to challenge them. He stepped aside, letting them pass. Inside, the VIP area was more subdued, less noise, more shadows. And there, in the corner, Sarah spotted him. Victor Klein. He was seated with a group of men, his sharp eyes scanning the room. The moment his gaze met hers, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. He didn't seem surprised to see them, almost like he had been expecting them all along. They were closer than ever to the truth. But Sarah knew, as she locked eyes with Klein, that whatever happened next would push them into a final dangerous confrontation. It was all or nothing. The room seemed to shrink as Sarah and William stood there, staring at Victor Klein, who had noticed them the moment they walked in. He didn't show fear. There was no surprise in his cold, calculating eyes. It was almost as if he'd been expecting them. The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Klein wasn't just a criminal. He was a player in a much larger game, and he knew exactly how to stay ahead of them. "Detectives," Klein's voice was smooth, almost amused, as he leaned back in his chair. "I must say, I didn't expect to see you here, but I suppose you've come for answers." Sarah's heart raced, but she didn't let it show. She kept her expression neutral, her hand resting casually on the holster at her side. She wasn't here to bluff. Not anymore. "We're not here for pleasantries, Klein," Williams said, stepping forward, his voice calm but firm. "We know you're connected to Marie, and we know you're involved in something much bigger than petty crime. This isn't about drugs or weapons anymore. It's about people's lives, lives that you've destroyed." Klein chuckled softly, swirling his drink before taking a long sip. He set the glass down slowly, his eyes never leaving them. "You think you understand what you're dealing with, Detective?" Klein said. "You think this is about what you can see, the drugs, the money, the lives lost? You're only scratching the surface. This is about power, control, and in the end, power always wins." Sarah took a step forward, narrowing her eyes. "Then help us understand, Klein. Help us understand why Marie's involved in this. What is it you're hiding? Klein's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only cold, calculating malice. I don't owe you an explanation, he said, but since you're so determined to play this game, fine. Let me give you a little hint. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The people you're up against are much bigger than anything you've ever dealt with. They're not just criminals. They're the ones who control everything behind the scenes, the ones who pull the strings from the shadows. And Marie, well, she's just the beginning. Williams took a step back, glancing at Sarah. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, processing Klein's words. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment they had to break through Klein's defenses and get the truth out of him. Who are these people, Klein? Sarah demanded. Who's pulling the strings? And what's Marie's role in all of this? Klein's smile never wavered. That's the real question, isn't it? You think you're chasing one person, but it's never been about her. She's a tool, just like you, just like everyone else in this game. And the moment you realize that, you'll understand why you can't win. Enough with the riddles, Williams said, stepping forward again. Tell us what you know. For a moment, Klein seemed to consider him. Then, slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat. The movement was fluid, almost graceful, but there was no mistaking the danger that hung in the air. He was no longer just a criminal. They had stepped into his territory, and he was in control. Do you really think you can just walk into my world and take what you want? Klein's voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. You have no idea who you're dealing with. These people, they control everything, and they're untouchable. All you're doing is making yourselves targets. Sarah's mind raced. What was Klein trying to say? There was something bigger than just him, something far more dangerous than a single criminal network. She glanced at Williams, who gave her a brief, almost imperceptible nod. They both knew they had to be careful here. Pushing Klein too far might make him snap, and they couldn't afford to lose him just yet. You're right about one thing, Sarah said, her voice steady. We don't know everything, but that's why we're here, to find out who's really behind this, and to stop them. Klein studied her for a long moment, his eyes calculating, before he spoke again. You think you can stop them? You can't even stop me. Do you really think you're ready for what's coming? Before Sarah could respond, Klein's phone buzzed loudly, cutting through the tension in the air. He glanced down at the screen, his face tightening for just a second. It was a subtle shift, but it was enough for Sarah to see that something had changed. You're not going to get the answers you're looking for here, Klein said, his tone shifting, becoming colder. But I'll leave you with this. There's always a price to pay. You may think you're on the right side of this fight, but once you cross certain lines, there's no going back. Marie isn't the one you should be worried about. It's the people who control her. He turned to leave, but Sarah wasn't ready to let him go. Who controls her, Klein? Who's behind all of this? She asked, her voice urgent. Klein paused, glancing back over his shoulder. There was something in his expression, something almost amused. Too late for that now, he said, his voice low. You should have listened when you had the chance. Klein walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Sarah and Williams standing there with nothing but questions and a rising sense of dread. Sarah's mind raced with the implications of what Klein had said. The people who control her. Who were they? And how deep did this go? They didn't have time to waste. They had to move fast. We need to find out who Klein's really working for, Sarah said, her voice filled with urgency. He's not just a pawn in this. He's part of something much bigger. Williams nodded. I'll start digging into Klein's connections. We need to know who he's been in contact with, who's been funding his operations. It's our best shot at finding out who's really pulling the strings. We don't have much time, Sarah said, her tone dark. If Klein's right, the people behind this, they're untouchable. But that doesn't mean we won't try. As they left the nightclub and headed back to the car, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to step into a war that they were woefully unprepared for. The people they were after weren't just criminals. They were a power so entrenched, so well hidden, that even the police couldn't reach them. But that didn't matter. Not anymore. They were already in this fight, and there was no turning back. The hours following their meeting with Klein were a blur of activity. Sarah and Williams worked tirelessly, chasing leads, following up on connections, and digging into anything that might give them the upper hand. The sense of urgency was palpable. The threat looming over them was bigger than they could have imagined, and every minute they wasted could push them further into the enemy's grasp. Back at the station, Sarah sat at her desk, her fingers running over a stack of reports, trying to make sense of the fragments of information they had. She'd reviewed every possible lead involving Klein's associates, but so far, nothing concrete had surfaced. It was frustrating. She knew they were getting closer, but the pieces didn't fit together yet. Williams was pacing in the corner of the office, a cup of coffee in hand, his face tight with frustration. I've been digging into Klein's financial records. The guy's got layers upon layers of shell companies, fake identities. He's nearly untouchable. But one thing's clear. He's been in touch with someone high up, someone with a lot of power. Sarah glanced up at him. High up? What do you mean? Williams set the coffee cup down on his desk and walked over to Sarah. I've found evidence that Klein's been working with someone in the upper echelons of the government. These transactions don't make sense unless you're looking at someone with a lot of pull. This goes beyond organized crime. Her heart skipped a beat. Government connections. It was the last thing she wanted to hear. But the deeper they dug, the more it seemed that everything they thought they knew about the case was just a smokescreen. We need to follow the money, Sarah said, her voice low. We need to find out who's funding Klein's operations. If he's got government ties, then the person behind him might have even more power than we can imagine. Williams nodded. I've already reached out to some people I know in finance. They're working on tracking down any unusual transactions that could point to a larger network. We'll get something. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. She needed a breakthrough. They both did. But with every dead end, the weight of the case grew heavier, and the enemy's shadow seemed to grow longer. That evening, as Sarah walked back to her car, a sense of unease settled over her. The city around her was alive with noise, the hum of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, but it all felt distant. She was starting to feel the full weight of the danger they were in. Every step she took seemed to echo with the knowledge that they were being watched. The people they were after had eyes everywhere. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Williams. Check your email. Something big just came through. Sarah's pulse quickened. She jogged to her car, unlocked it, and slid into the driver's seat, pulling up her phone. As the email loaded, her breath caught in her throat. It was a report on a financial transaction, a large sum of money being funneled into Klein's network, but there was something strange about the origin. The funds had come from a corporation based in Washington, D.C., a corporation that had recently been implicated in a political scandal. She knew the name, Barton Industries, a name that had been floating in the shadows of Washington's elite for years, a powerful company with ties to several high-profile political figures. They were the last people anyone would suspect to be involved in a criminal enterprise. Sarah's stomach churned. This was bigger than they thought. She quickly called Williams. He answered on the second ring. "Did you see it?" he asked, his voice tight with excitement. "I did," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Barton Industries. How the hell does Klein get involved with them? And why are they funneling money into his operations?" "I don't know yet," Williams replied. "But this changes everything. If Barton's involved, we're talking about a conspiracy that reaches into the very heart of the government." "We need to move fast," Sarah said. "I'm heading to D.C. first thing tomorrow. We need answers, and we need them now." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Be careful, Sarah. Barton's not a name you can throw around lightly. If they're involved, we're not just up against Klein anymore. We're dealing with an entire network that has the power to destroy us." "I know," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "But we can't back down. We've already gone too far to turn back." The next morning, Sarah boarded a plane to Washington, D.C. The journey felt endless, her mind racing the entire way. Barton Industries. It was all connected. The corruption, the lies, the hidden agendas. It was all starting to come into focus. But there were still so many unanswered questions. Who in the government was involved? How deep did Barton's influence go? And what role did Marie play in all of this? As soon as she arrived in D.C., she headed straight to the office of a former colleague, a journalist named Peter Reynolds. Peter had connections that went beyond what Sarah could access as a detective. He had inside sources, people who could get information without the red tape and bureaucracy of law enforcement. If anyone could help them get closer to Barton, it was Peter. Peter greeted her at the door of his small office, his usual casual demeanor replaced with a look of concern when he saw her. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. "I need your help," Sarah said, stepping into the office and closing the door behind her. "It's about Barton Industries. I know they're involved in something illegal, and I need everything you've got on them. Names, connections, anything." Peter hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I've been digging into Barton for months now. There's more going on here than anyone realizes, but getting too close could cost you. Hell, it could cost you everything. These guys are dangerous." "I don't have a choice," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "People's lives are at stake. I need to know everything." Peter pulled open a drawer and retrieved a file. He handed it to her, and as she flipped through the pages, her eyes widened. The connections were staggering. Barton Industries wasn't just a corporation. It was a powerful network that spanned across multiple industries, with ties to law enforcement, politicians, and even international intelligence agencies. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. They were in over their heads. Sarah flipped through the file Peter had given her, her fingers tightening with every new revelation. The deeper she read, the worse it got. Barton Industries wasn't just laundering money for criminals. They were orchestrating entire operations. From human trafficking to government manipulation, their reach extended into places she never imagined. She looked up at Peter, whose face was lined with exhaustion. "How long have you known?" she asked. Peter sighed, rubbing his temples. "I've been chasing this for 2 years. Every time I get close, the trail goes cold. Witnesses disappear, evidence vanishes, sources refuse to talk. Barton isn't just powerful, they're untouchable." Sarah shook her head. "Nobody's untouchable. There's always a way." Peter leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Sarah, listen to me. If you go after them, they will come for you. They'll make you disappear just like they did with Emily Foster. Just like they did with Rachel Daniels." At the mention of Rachel, Sarah froze. Wait, Rachel Daniels? Emily's best friend? Peter exhaled slowly. Yeah, she was onto something. She was the one who first brought me the lead on Barton. She told me Emily had found something she wasn't supposed to. Then, right before she was supposed to meet with me, she vanished. Sarah's stomach twisted. Rachel didn't run. She was silenced. She pulled out her phone and dialed Williams. He picked up instantly. Tell me you have something, he said. Sarah didn't waste time. It's bigger than we thought. Barton isn't just involved. They're running everything. And Rachel Daniels? She knew. She was going to expose them. And now she's missing. Williams cursed under his breath. So, Emily was killed because she found out the truth, and Rachel disappeared for the same reason? Looks like it. Williams hesitated. Then we need to find Rachel. If she's still alive, she's the only person who can confirm what Emily knew. Sarah nodded, already feeling the weight of that responsibility pressing down on her. I'll start here in D.C., see if I can trace her last known movements. You keep digging into Klein. He's still the closest link we have. I'm on it, Williams said. But be careful, Sarah. If Barton knows you're in D.C., you're a target. She ended the call and looked back at Peter. I need Rachel's last known address. Peter hesitated. Sarah. I don't have time for hesitation, she snapped. Every second we wait, we lose ground. Where did Rachel go before she disappeared? Peter sighed, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out another file. Her last known location was an old apartment complex in Arlington. She moved there right before she went off the grid. Sarah grabbed the file and stood. If she's still alive, I'm going to find her. The drive to Arlington was tense. Sarah kept glancing at her rearview mirror, half expecting a black SUV to appear behind her. Williams had been right. Barton wouldn't let her dig this deep without consequences. She reached the apartment complex just before dusk. It was a run-down building, the kind of place where people disappeared without anyone asking questions. Sarah parked down the street, grabbed her gun, and approached the entrance. The halls were dimly lit, the air stale. She checked the file. Apartment 3B. She knocked, waiting, her pulse quickening. No answer. She knocked again. Rachel? If you're in there, I just want to talk. Then, a sound inside. A shuffle. Sarah's hand moved to her holster. Rachel, I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to know what happened to Emily. Nothing. Sarah tried the doorknob. Unlocked. She pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. The apartment was dark, the air thick with dust. The furniture was covered with sheets, as if no one had lived there for months. But someone had been here. A plate sat on the counter, a half-eaten sandwich beside it. A laptop was open on the couch. Someone had left in a hurry. Sarah moved deeper into the apartment, her senses on high alert. Rachel, she called again. Then something moved behind her. She spun. Too late. A shadow lunged. Sarah's instincts kicked in. She ducked as an arm swung toward her, narrowly missing her head. She grabbed her attacker's wrist and twisted, forcing them back. A woman stumbled into the dim light. Blonde. Gaunt. Rachel. Sarah raised her hands. Wait! I'm not here to hurt you! Rachel's wild eyes darted to the door, then back to Sarah. Who sent you? She demanded, her voice hoarse. Was it them? Sarah shook her head. No one sent me. I'm here because of Emily. I know she found something, and I know Barton killed her to cover it up. Rachel's face twisted in fear. She backed away, shaking her head. No. You don't understand. They see everything. They know everything. Sarah took a slow step forward. Then help me stop them. Rachel's breathing was ragged. You can't stop them. I can try. Rachel swallowed hard. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she exhaled shakily. Emily found something. Something in Barton's records. It was buried, hidden deep in their financial transactions. Money being moved offshore, disappearing into shell companies. She thought she could expose them. Sarah's mind raced. And you have proof? Rachel's expression darkened. I had proof. What do you mean? Rachel hesitated, then walked to the couch, picking up the laptop. She opened it, typing quickly. A moment later, a folder appeared on the screen. Emily copied the files, Rachel said. She hid them in an encrypted drive. Sarah stared at the screen. This was it. The smoking gun. The evidence that could bring down Barton. But Rachel's expression turned grim. It's not enough. What do you mean? Sarah asked. Rachel turned to her, her voice barely a whisper. They already know you're here. The words barely had time to register before a gunshot shattered the window. Rachel screamed. Sarah dove for cover. More shots rang out, glass exploding as bullets tore through the apartment. They had been found. Sarah grabbed Rachel's arm. We have to go. Now! Rachel hesitated, fear paralyzing her. Sarah pulled her toward the door. Rachel, if we don't move, we die. Run! Rachel snapped out of it and bolted, following Sarah into the hallway. Sarah didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could hear them coming. Barton's men. And they weren't going to stop until both she and Rachel were dead. Sarah sprinted down the dimly lit hallway, Rachel right behind her. Bullets shredded the air, splintering the doorframe behind them. The sound of heavy boots pounded up the stairwell. They were out of time. Think, Sarah. Think. The fire escape. She grabbed Rachel's wrist and yanked her toward a side hallway. A rusted metal door loomed ahead. Sarah shoved it open with her shoulder, sending it crashing against the brick wall outside. The fire escape groaned under their weight as they barreled down the stairs, two at a time. A black SUV screeched to a halt in the alley below, the same kind of vehicle she'd seen following her before. The back doors flung open and two men jumped out, armed. Rachel froze. We're trapped! Sarah's mind raced. They couldn't go back. They couldn't go forward. Then she spotted it, a pile of old wooden crates stacked near the dumpster. Jump, she ordered. Rachel hesitated. Are you insane? Sarah didn't answer. She vaulted over the railing, landing on the crates with a painful crash. The impact rattled her bones, but she was up in an instant. She looked up at Rachel. Jump, now! Rachel clenched her jaw, took a breath, and leaped. She landed hard, but Sarah dragged her up, and they bolted down the alley. Gunshots erupted behind them, ricocheting off metal dumpsters. They turned a corner, sprinting into the city streets. Traffic screeched as they darted across an intersection, nearly getting clipped by a cab. A woman screamed. Someone shouted. But Sarah didn't stop. They needed to disappear. Now, up ahead, she spotted an underground parking garage. It wasn't perfect, but it would buy them time. She grabbed Rachel's arm and pulled her inside. They ducked behind a parked sedan, chests heaving. Rachel's face was pale, her breath ragged. They'll find us, she whispered. Sarah shook her head. Not if we move smart. She scanned the area. They couldn't stay here long. But before she could formulate a plan, Rachel spoke again. I need to tell you something. Sarah frowned. Now's not the time. It is, Rachel insisted. I wasn't completely honest with you before. Sarah's stomach tightened. About what? Rachel swallowed hard. The files Emily found? She didn't just find them. She was given them. Sarah's blood ran cold. By who? Rachel hesitated, then whispered, Someone inside Barton. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. You're telling me there's a whistleblower? Rachel nodded. Someone on the inside wanted the truth to come out. They gave Emily access to Barton's darkest secrets. And when Barton found out, they had her killed. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a case of Emily stumbling onto the truth. Someone had wanted her to expose it. But why? And who? Sarah didn't have time to process it. A black SUV rolled into the parking garage. Rachel grabbed Sarah's arm. What do we do? Sarah scanned the lot, spotting an old sedan with its windows cracked open. She sprinted toward it, reached inside, and yanked the door handle. It was unlocked. Get in, she ordered. Rachel hesitated. This is stealing. Would you rather be dead? Rachel scrambled into the passenger seat. Sarah ducked under the steering wheel and ripped the panel beneath it. She found the ignition wires and twisted them together. The car coughed, then roared to life. Rachel stared. How the hell? Sarah shoved the gear into reverse. Bad habits from my teenage years. Hold on. The tires screeched as she slammed the gas, peeling out of the garage just as gunfire erupted behind them. They tore through the streets, weaving between cars. The SUV was right on their tail. Rachel clutched the dashboard. They're gaining on us! Sarah clenched her jaw. Not for long. She swerved hard into an alleyway, barely squeezing through the narrow gap between buildings. The SUV tried to follow, too fast. There was a sickening crunch as the vehicle slammed into a steel dumpster, stopping dead. Rachel let out a breath. That was insane. Sarah grinned despite herself. I get that a lot. She didn't slow down until they reached an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. She pulled the car inside, killed the engine, and exhaled. For the first time that night, silence. Rachel turned to her. Now what? Sarah pulled out her phone. Now, we finish this. She dialed Williams. He answered immediately. Sarah? Where the hell are you? Safe, she said. For now. But listen, Rachel has the files. We have proof. A pause. Then Williams said, That's good, but we've got a problem. Sarah's stomach clenched. What now? They just found Klein, Williams said. Dead. Rachel gasped. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. What happened? Shot twice, execution style, Williams said. No witnesses, no security footage. Clean hit. Sarah cursed under her breath. Barton was tying up loose ends. We need to move fast, she said. If they're cleaning house, we're next. Williams hesitated. You sure about this, Sarah? Once we go public with this, there's no turning back. She locked eyes with Rachel. The fear in the woman's eyes was still there, but beneath it, something else. Determination. I'm sure, Sarah said. Williams exhaled. All right, I'll set up the press conference. This is going to be messy. Sarah smiled grimly. Let's bring the house down. The next morning, the city was on fire. News outlets were running the story non-stop. Whistleblower exposes corruption at Barton Industries. Government ties to organized crime revealed. The evidence Rachel provided was damning. Offshore accounts, classified emails, financial records proving Barton's role in human trafficking, money laundering, and political manipulation. Barton's CEO was arrested within hours. High-ranking officials resigned in disgrace. The entire organization was crumbling. Sarah stood at the police station, watching the chaos unfold on the news. Rachel sat beside her, still shaken but alive. Williams walked in, a grin on his face. We did it. Sarah nodded. Yeah, we did. For the first time in months, she felt light. The weight she'd been carrying was gone. Rachel turned to her. Emily would be proud. Sarah smiled. Yeah, she would. Outside, the city kept moving. Life went on, but Sarah knew the truth. They had won, and that was enough. For now.